we're going to continue our program, and I know our next speaker likes to exchange ideas with young people, and he also would welcome any questions you might want to ask. He's a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, served 2 terms as Secretary General of the United Nations, wrote the book Interventions, A Life in War and Peace, and remains active in conflict resolution activities worldwide. But most important, he's a hopeful man and knows that change is always possible. It is a great honor to introduce to you Mr. Kofi Annan.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I don't see you because of the lights, but I know you are here because I can hear you. I am Kofi Annan. Let me introduce myself. And I know you find it strange that I should start by introducing myself, but I've learned over the years not to walk around or go to a place and assume everybody knows who you are. And I learned from an experience where my wife and I had decided to take a holiday, quiet holiday, get to a place incognito and rest quietly. And we were able to stay quiet for a while. And then we decided to go to the village to get a newspaper. And in no time, a group of men in one corner stood staring at us. And then one of them broke away and walked towards us. And I turned to my wife and said, gosh, we have 6 more weeks to go, and we have blown our cover. By then, the man was on top of me, and he put out his hand and said, Morgan Freeman. May I have an autograph? And I said, sure. And I signed K. Freeman. He was happy, and we were happy. We kept our anonymity and continued our holidays. But it teaches you not to walk around thinking everybody knows who you are. Well, I'm extremely happy to be here with you this afternoon. I have a very soft spot for Holland. I have many friends here, and I've worked with many of your compatriots at the UN, from Jan Pronk to Al Merket to Bert Koenders, former Prime Minister Lubbers, and I've seen young Dutch people all around the world working in humanitarian situations, difficult situations, in remote villages, trying to help others who are in difficulty. And so I've grown to admire and have quite a lot of respect for the dynamism of the young people of this nation. And from across the world, I see these young people everywhere, and they give you hope, because they go to places where sometimes governments are afraid to send their soldiers. But they go there because they want to make a contribution, and they feel there's something to be done. And so once again, let me thank you for being engaged at this early stage, not waiting till you get to a certain age or you mature or you grow before you get engaged. It is important that you become involved early, that you take responsibility early, and you are at an age where one is idealistic and wants to do things. And besides, I see you as the leaders of the 21st century. So for you to want to begin your political and social engagement early and to take responsibility is wonderful. So let's give the young ones a hand. Yeah. People often ask me, why did you decide to write a book, write about your experiences and write about right intervention? I did it because I was fortunate enough to have had the life I've had, to be Secretary General at a time when we went through major events not in terms of political, military conflicts, not in terms of human beings killing each other, But at times when we were dealing with issues like how do we combat HIV/AIDS, how do we fight poverty, how do we make this world better, how do we take on climate change, and so forth and so forth. And of course, we also had the military and political confrontations we had to deal with. And I was involved in quite a lot of them, and some of them took place here in Amsterdam, in your country, where I was able to bring people here to discuss conflicts, and I will tell you a bit more about it. So I decided to share my experience in the hope that when it is read, and particularly by the young, as they grow up, that they would also want to take up public service. They would want to serve their government, serve the international community, and play whatever role that they can. I know there is a tendency in some countries where the feeling is public service is not for me, politics is not for me, I want to go into business, I want to make money. Of course, now we are going through financial crisis and people do not think it's so dignified to be called a banker, so they are not rushing into Wall Street and the financial centers. But I hope you will get involved in public service. It can be challenging, it can be exciting, it can be interesting. And we should not sit back and say politics is not for me, it's for the other. And the question I often ask, if all the smart ones, the smart young people, the smart people decide to set out public service and politics, whom do you think is going to make the laws for you and me? Is going to enforce the laws for you and me? I think we need to think that. And I've often been asked as I travel around the world, what do I do? And usually by young people, what do I do to become a good global citizen? And I always tell them it begins in your community, in your university, in your school. When you see something going wrong, don't just walk on. Stop, pay attention, and sometimes even intervene. And intervening doesn't mean you have to go and hit somebody. I mean, sometimes it's enough to see somebody being bullied and two people fighting, and for a third party, a bystander, to say, stop, this is wrong. That can make a real difference for the victim. It encourages him or her to fight back, to stand up, and gives them courage to defend themselves. And we have to remember that we don't have to take on the big challenges. Whatever little we can do in our own little corner makes a difference, and collectively we make a giant step forward. And we should remember that even the big events starts with one small thing. Even genocide starts with the humiliation of one individual. And so if we can do something at the individual level and protect someone, we are moving ahead. I grew up in Ghana. I'm a Ghanaian. And I grew up when I was a teenager. We were going through the struggle for independence. And it was a very exciting period. They talk about a new country, a country that is going to take charge of its own destiny, develop its economy and social and political norms. And as young people, we were so excited. I was in a boarding school and we used to play roles, pretending we were politicians, arguing one side of the case or the other. And then, of course, we achieved independence and lots of changes followed. Suddenly, the police commissioner was an African, the head of the army, the head of government. And so I grew up with the feeling that change is possible, even dramatic change is possible. And this has also helped me go through life trying to change things and challenge things. You know, and I'm sure some of you will join groups, you will join bureaucracies, you will join companies. And I find that sometimes the greatest impediment to change and reform is the restraint people, whether they are bureaucrats or workers, put on themselves. When you throw out an idea, can we do this? Can we try this? They say, no, it's never been done. It will never work. Or the boss will not accept it. The governments will not accept it. That's not good enough. You have to test it. You have to try it. And so don't put unnecessary restraints on yourself within the system. You should be able to challenge and make things. Anyway, that's where it started for me in Ghana. And then I went to study in the United States and in Europe, and then started my international career in my 20s with the World Health Organization in Geneva. And at that point, I thought I would work with them for 2 years and then go back home. But one thing led to the other. I became Secretary General, and here I am. But let me assure you, I'm not one of those who will pretend that at the age of 10, I knew exactly what I was going to do, and that all that I wanted to be was Secretary General. It's not true. Nothing could have been further away from my mind, but one thing led to the other, and it happened. And as Secretary General, I realized that the UN couldn't do everything. One of the first questions I asked myself was, what can the UN do? What should the UN do? What can the UN do alone? What should the UN do with others? And what should the UN leave others to do? And how do we expand our capacity? People see us as big, but we have very limited capacity. And one of the ideas, and of course the charter itself was written in the name of we the peoples. And yet, when you went to the UN headquarters, you hardly saw we the peoples in the building and around. So I decided to open up the UN to civil society, to the private sector, to universities, for us to work in partnership to achieve the goals that we all strive for, and to remind ourselves that the ideals and principles the UN exists to protect and defend belongs to the people, we the peoples in whose name the Charter was written. And so with that approach and opening up, I tried to steer the organization in a direction where we didn't only focus on political conflicts, the sort of conflicts we dealt with in peacekeeping operations, whether in Rwanda, Somalia, Bosnia. I write about it in the book Interventions, explaining that before the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, it was extremely difficult for the Security Council to agree on certain decisions. And so when you look at the history of the UN, very few peacekeeping operations were organized until that point. After the collapse of the wall and end of the Cold War, the Council, in a way, was liberalized, and they felt they could now do what they were set up to do without much acrimony and tension. Another decision was taken that peacekeepers can operate in internal situations. Until then, they had not been involved in civil war situations. It was mainly interstate wars. When two countries go to war, they sign an agreement. We will send in troops to monitor that they comply with the agreement and to ensure that both sides behave themselves. But of course, with the collapse of the wall and the new activism of the Council, we got thrown into many civil war situations, which should have implied that we go in with much better equipped forces, more troops, and of course that was not the case. We continued dealing with the new situation with the old tools we had, which isn't always the best way to proceed, because the UN doesn't have an army. We borrow our troops from the governments. And so it's when the crises have exploded that we go about trying to put together an army. Sometimes we get them very quickly, sometimes it takes months, and by then the problem could have expanded, whilst if we had the troops and moved quickly, we could have nipped it in the bud. And so the way we organize our peacekeeping troops is a bit like telling the mayor of Leiden that we know periodically there'll be fire in the city, and you will need a firehouse and fire trucks, but we'll give them to you when the fire breaks. You can't operate that way and protect the city and the people as effectively as you would. But that is where it is. But I think we've also had situations where sometimes the UN has given the approval, but a coalition of the willing have come together to put a force together to intervene. One such intervention was the first Iraq war, when Iraq went into Kuwait. The coalition was large, deep, approved by the council. They went in and pushed Iraq out. And they went in with credible force, and it did the thing. And sometimes you have to show force in order not to use force. When you arrive in credible, robust manner, the other side may not necessarily take you on. We have also, apart from the military interventions, we've done work on poverty, on HIV/AIDS, and a whole range of other things, trying to improve human rights and the rule of law, which is extremely important. And we've come up with the new norm responsibility to protect. And as I said, on HIV/AIDS, for example, I invited the heads of 7 largest pharmaceutical companies to meet me in Amsterdam with the head of World Health Organization, who was then Dr. Gro Brundtland of Norway, and Peter Piot, who was head of UNAIDS, trying to convince the gentlemen, and they were all men, I'm afraid, trying to convince the gentlemen that you cannot have medication that can save the lives of people living with AIDS, but the poor can't have access to it because they are poor, and insist on protecting your intellectual property. At that time, in fact, they had a case in South Africa against President Mandela because he had threatened to use compulsory licensing to produce cheaper versions of the medication for his population, who were being decimated by the disease. So I told them in Amsterdam conference room that I'm not a public relations expert. I don't know who yours is, but to go and sue Nelson Mandela in a South African court on an issue like HIV/AIDS, if you lose, you lose. If you win, you lose and lose and lose. And with all the bad publicity that come with it. We were able over time to come to understanding with these pharmaceutical companies, and the prices came down considerably, in addition to the money that the Global Fund was able to canvass and receive from governments. The prices came down, and we were able to extend assistance to the poor living with HIV, and we've saved millions of lives. Those kinds of interventions are also important. On the question of poverty, the member states agreed on the Millennium Development Goals, goals such as ensuring that people who go to bed hungry are reduced by 50%, ensuring that people have clean drinking water, which we take for granted here, but it's almost a luxury in some parts of the world, to ensure that young people, children, particularly girls, get a primary education. The whole world agreed to this basic framework to help the poor, and that was a very encouraging form of intervention. And the goals were such that the average man or woman, whether they live in Bogota or Havana or Accra or Nairobi, understood what it meant. And they could, with civil society, put pressure on their governments to try and deliver this. I talked about peacekeeping operations and referred to responsibility to protect. It was after the crisis in Somalia, in Rwanda, Bosnia, Kosovo, we all kept wondering, how can we do better? And I, for one, who had gone through these traumatic experiences, also thought very hard about it. And in 1999, at the General Assembly, I suggested to the member states that we needed to think about this. And at that time, the term was humanitarian intervention, that the international community had to act if faced with certain brutal and tragic situations, particularly in situations where the government's concerned are either unable to do it or do not want to protect their own people. So basically, we were to send out the message that governments can no longer use sovereignty as a shield behind which they brutalize their own people. But that norm, the norm responsibility to protect, which it was subsequently named, also means that those of us outside that particular country have no excuse not to want to act. We cannot say it's an internal matter and we should not interfere. The message is some crimes are so shameful, so unacceptable, that we cannot sit back and we have to do something about it. And it doesn't mean you always have to use force. You use political, diplomatic, economic, and other pressures, and force as the last resort. But that norm puts dictators and people on notice. And obviously it's not going to be completely implemented overnight, and it will take time. International community, being as it is, will intervene in some situations and not in others. Some situations may lend themselves to intervention, whilst others may not. But the fact that you cannot intervene everywhere does not mean you should not intervene where you can. When people say you have to intervene everywhere and nowhere, I remind them this is it's a bit like telling the police, don't arrest any criminal until you can arrest all of them. It's not a realistic approach. So let me conclude here by telling you that as I went through my UN experience and the life I have lived, I've become absolutely convinced that healthy, balanced societies have to be built on 3 pillars. The first is stability and peace. You need that for people to be able to go about their business and develop. The second is development. You need peace and stability and development. But the third pillar, which is extremely important, we don't often, in my mind, discuss it enough. That third pillar is rule of law and respect for human rights. Because if these activities are not rooted in rule of law, they cannot be long-lasting. Example I give is, for example, if 2 years ago I had come to this hall and asked you, what do you think of Tunisia? I'm thinking of going there. I think the answer I would have gotten is it's a wonderful country, it's stable, it's peaceful, and economically they are doing very well. I wouldn't have heard about rule of law and human rights. And we're told it's a great tourist destination. And yet it was the absence of that third pillar that led to the events we saw with the Arab awakening, or what some others call Arab Spring. And so the 3 pillars are extremely important, and we should bear them in mind as we move on and try and develop communities. And of course, the other point I have made is that sovereignty can no longer be a shield behind which governments can brutalize their people, which implies that sovereignty offers states rights, privileges, but they also have responsibility. Responsibility towards their people, their welfare, and of course, the people everywhere today are demanding a say in how they are governed, whom they are governed, and by what means. Thank you. Let's have a conversation then. Thank you.
Very much, Mr. Annan.
Thank you.
And we are glad you will stay a little bit longer.